Thank you, everybody, for being here again. Before we start the next session, which will be about evidence regarding consciousness in vertebrates, brief remarks from Dave Chalmers.
Yeah, I just wanted to take a moment to mark some very, very sad news that just came in regarding a pioneer in this area. Daniel Dennett apparently died in the last day or so. News is just going out over philosophy wires. It's a huge shock. I just saw him 2 weeks ago in Santa Fe, and actually he was fragile, but in okay shape. Dan was obviously a giant in the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of cognitive science. Made enormous contributions to thinking about both human and animal consciousness and their relationship. He actually, at the conference on animal consciousness that we had here about maybe 6 years ago, he spoke there and made wonderful contributions at the end with a somewhat skeptical perspective on animal consciousness, as I alluded to before. But Dan always loved dialogue about these things. Always thought very deeply, philosophically, scientifically. Extraordinary philosopher, and it's really an enormous loss. But I thought we should at least just take a moment to mark Dan's passing at this event. And let me now hand it over to Kristen, who's going to moderate the next session.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, Dan Dennett really was an inspiration for me from the very beginning of my career as a baby philosopher. He wrote some of the first papers on animal minds and animal consciousness, and then he wrote a book called Kinds of Minds, where he discussed animals, which has the best title of any book on animal consciousness and animal minds. So it's been a rough month. We've lost a lot of really great figures in this field. But we have wonderful, young, and vibrant figures in this field as well that I'm very excited to introduce now for our next session. I'm going to introduce all three of them and invite you all to come up and sit for this session, as I've been instructed, if that's all right. So first up, we'll have Noam Miller. He's an associate professor of behavioral neuroscience in the psychology and biology departments at Wilfrid Laurier University. His research focuses on collective cognition, primarily in snakes and fish. He's a former associate editor at Animal Cognition, current co-series editor of the Routledge Research and Comparative Cognition book series, and he serves as president of the Comparative Cognition Society. I can do it one at a time. Go ahead, Noam.
There we go. Okay. Thank you. nydeclaration.com. I'd like to start just giving you a little roadmap of what I'd like to talk about. I'm going to talk primarily about three of the markers that Jonathan laid out: pain, pleasure, and then social complexity. And then at the end, I'll say just a few words about self-recognition in reptiles. And for each of these things, I'm going to try to primarily give you two kinds of evidence. Mostly, I'll be talking about the behavioral evidence. But wherever possible, I'm going to try to bring some of the neuroscience and brain anatomy into it, as much as we know. And I'm also going to say a few words about evolutionary kinds of evidence. And what I hope emerges from all of this is that there's quite good evidence for the various markers in different kinds of reptiles, but it seems unlikely that the kinds of consciousness that reptiles have are similar to the kinds of consciousness that mammals have. And this is a challenge that I think we need to rise to. I also hope that as I'm talking, you will see that there's a massive lack of research on reptile cognition generally, and we need to have more. I'm going to be citing a lot of different papers in my talk, and I've collected all the various references to those at this website, and I'll put this link back up again at the end. So here's an evolutionary tree or phylogeny of a group of animals called the amniotes, which includes mammals, birds, and reptiles. So as we move left to right here, we're moving forwards in time. This is a simplified tree. And the first thing that you can see on here, which I think most of you probably already know, is that birds are reptiles. This means that to the extent that evolution provides good evidence for consciousness, everything that we know about birds is relevant when we're thinking about reptiles. To put that another way, if we accept that mammals and birds are conscious, then either consciousness evolved at least twice in each of those lineages separately, or it's ancestral to all of the amniotes, in which case reptiles are probably conscious as well. The second thing that you can see on this tree is just how ancient and diverse reptiles as a group are. Snakes and lizards, for example, are about as closely related to each other as you are to a platypus. And I think because we have so little research on reptiles, the fact that the various groups of reptiles have been going their own way for so long should make us particularly wary about drawing broad generalizations across the entire class. And so you'll see on my slides, I'll try to talk about the individual species that we actually have data on, and not perhaps say too much about reptiles in general, because I'm not sure that there's such a thing as reptiles in general. A case in point is the study of pain, which, as Jonathan pointed out, is one of the main markers that we care about. Going through the various types of evidence for pain that philosophers talk about, I know of only one paper that shows any kind of motivational trade-off in a reptile, and this is iguanas leaving a warm place to go find food. It's at best mild discomfort. I don't think it rises to the level of pain. I know of only 2 papers that show any reptiles guarding an injured site, in this case, post-surgery. By far the most common test, however, of pain in reptiles is this heat withdrawal test. So underneath the center of this white cross in the image is a powerful infrared beam that can quickly heat up the hind leg of this bearded dragon. And we can turn that on and watch how hot it gets before the bearded dragon removes its leg from the heat. This is what that looks like in practice. This turtle has its hind leg on the heat, and eventually, as it gets hotter and hotter, the turtle will withdraw its limb, presumably because the heat became uncomfortable or painful. And my thanks to Kurt Sladke for letting me show this video. When you do this, you can also give the animals various painkillers or analgesics to see if that increases the amount of heat that they'll tolerate before they withdraw their limbs. And when you do this, so opioids like morphine, for example, which we know are very effective painkillers in mammals, seem to also work in a range of different reptiles. But interestingly, not in all reptiles, and in particular not in either of the 2 species of snake that have been tested on this. But there are other analgesics, things like the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, which do work in snakes and in some other reptiles. This may seem like a weirdly idiosyncratic selection of evidence to show you, and I want to emphasize that it's not a selection. There's a lot of anecdotal information out there, but as near as I can tell, this represents more or less the entirety of the experimental research on pain in reptiles. It's minuscule. And so again, we need a lot more of it. A couple of general points about this. First of all, these data on painkillers don't quite rise to the level that my philosopher colleagues would like to see as a marker for pain. Nobody has ever asked, as far as I know, whether any reptile will seek out painkillers, will self-administer painkillers, will learn the location of painkillers and then prefer that location. All of that work remains to be done. Secondly, as far as we know, in both the skins and brains of reptiles, the anatomy of pain seems to be very similar to what we find in mammals. In other words, it's not that morphine doesn't work on snakes because snakes don't have opioid receptors in their brains. They absolutely do. It's just that pain works differently in reptiles than it does in mammals. What about the opposite of pain, pleasure? Jonathan was mentioning we're looking for more evidence of positive affect now in animals. And we have a collection of evidence that I think hopefully speaks to pleasure in reptiles. First of all, we know that when a number of different reptile species are allowed to live in enriched environments, in very kind of good places, this improves their performance on a range of different cognitive tasks. We've also shown that some reptiles prefer these kinds of enriched spaces over unenriched spaces. And my students and I even have some data that's not quite published yet, showing that if we let hognose snakes live in this very, very enriched environment here, their brains actually grow bigger than those of snakes that live in less well-resourced neighborhoods. And this is an effect that is well known in mammals. In addition, Anna Wilkinson and her students have some data, also not quite published yet, showing that tortoises will show optimism. They can have a positive mood when you test them in the famous judgment bias task. And finally, there's quite a bit of evidence, primarily collected by Gordon Burkhardt over many years, showing that reptiles play. They show both social play, like this American alligator hitching a ride on her partner's back, and what people call object play, playing with actual toys, like this African soft-shelled turtle playing with these plastic rings hanging in its tank. So I think all of these things taken together suggest a capacity for being pleased, for being contented, and possibly for being discontented. Finally, I want to talk about social complexity. And here, we're actually in a situation where we have a lot of data, and I'm just going to sample a little bit of it. But if you want to read a lot more data about social complexity in reptiles, Sean Doody and Vlad Dinette and Gordon Burkhardt recently published a book called The Secret Social Lives of Reptiles, which contains pretty much everything we knew up until 2021 when it came out. We know that a number of different reptiles can learn socially, can learn from other individuals. For example, this bearded dragon has learned how to open this gate, not by having had previous experience of opening the gate, but simply by having previously watched a video of another bearded dragon open the gate in exactly the same way. And my thanks to Anna Wilkinson for letting me show this video. I rely on my friends a lot. We also know that a number of different reptile species can gaze follow, so they can tell where another individual is looking at and direct their gaze towards that same location, a task that, let it be whispered, even primates sometimes struggle with. We know that a number of different snake species form social networks in which they even have what we've called friends, specific other individuals that they prefer to spend time with. If you're a timber rattlesnake, your friends are your kin. We also just recently learned that some sea snakes will hunt in groups, even taking on different roles in the hunt. So one of the snakes will go flush the prey out, and the others will hang back and wait for the prey that come rushing out. Again, a very sophisticated activity that we might associate with mammals. In mammals, when mammals are doing all of these social things and others, these things activate a very specific set of brain areas that have been referred to as the social behavior network. And my students and I recently showed that when ball pythons are doing social things, that selectively activates pretty much the exact same network of brain areas in them. And so this suggests that the way that social information is processed in animals that don't really have a cortex, they have a three-layered cortex-ish-like thing, seems to be very similar to how this works in mammals. All of these things, again, taken together, suggest to us a very sophisticated and flexible conception of others and of what others are doing, of the behaviors of others. And these are things that might be linked to having a sophisticated representation of yourself. My students and I, building on some earlier work by Alexandra Horowitz and some earlier work by Gordon Burkhardt on garter snakes, recently showed that garter snakes can tell when their own scent has been modified and are very interested in this. And this is analogous to them passing an odor-based version of the famous mirror mark test of self-recognition. What I think is important is that when we do the exact same test using ball pythons, they don't pass the test. Maybe because they can't tell the differences between the odors, more likely, in my opinion, because they don't care. And I think this highlights a key point, which is that the kinds of cognitive skills that animals have, including consciousness, are a function of their evolutionary history and of their ecology. Which means that if everything that we've looked at leads us to perhaps infer that the best explanation is that reptiles might be conscious, I think we should expect to find differences in the details of what consciousness looks like across different reptiles, and we certainly shouldn't expect their consciousness to look anything like ours. Again, all my references are down there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Noam, for that. Next up, we have Anna Wilkinson. She's professor in the School of Life Sciences at the University of Lincoln in the UK. Her research focuses on animal perception, and in particular, she studies how reptiles and amphibians learn and retain information, and how that impacts the decisions that they make. Her work has revealed remarkable cognitive abilities in these groups, which has important implications for their welfare. Welcome, Anna.
Noam's obviously taller than me. Great, so let's find my talk. Brilliant, so thank you so much for inviting me to talk here today. And what I'm going to be telling you about is what we understand about amphibian sentience, what we know, what we don't know, and potential key questions that we need to think about for the future. So in general, amphibians have largely been neglected in terms of our understanding of their cognition, their emotions, and their need for sort of enriched and stimulating environments. But there are little spots of evidence that we do have, and I want to present these to you today. But before I do that, I think we have to think about what it is to be an amphibian. Okay, so amphibians have a really relatively unusual life cycle. It typically involves them laying eggs in the water, larvae hatching, and then going through this metamorphosis stage before they reach adulthood. And metamorphosis requires huge changes in their anatomy, including their brain structure as well. And indeed, amphibians have semi-permeable skin. They are ectothermic, and because of these things, they are massively impacted by the environment around them. So they are impacted by needing to access water and by the heat, and so they will have to brumate during times when it's cold. And for all of these reasons, it makes amphibians a really fascinating and unique group to start to understand sentience in, but also an incredibly challenging group to work with within this context. So just to tell you a little bit more about amphibians, there are around 8,000 species of amphibians that we know of at the moment, and of those, about 7,000 are frogs and toads. We have around 700 species of salamanders and just over 200 species of caecilian. Now, I expect that most of you know what frogs are. I expect a lot of you know what salamanders and newts are, but I expect actually a lot of you don't necessarily know what caecilians are. And these are a group of sort of limbless, worm-shaped amphibians, and they actually lead a really cryptic lifestyle. So they spend a lot of time under the ground or in streams, and because of that, we know very, very little about them. So when I'm talking to you today, I'm going to tell you about what I know, at least, of sentience in this group, and I'm going to try and label it with greens for frogs, browns for salamanders, and purples for caecilian. And you're not going to be seeing very much purple in the rest of this talk, which is a shame, because it's my favorite of these three colors. as always, and I think Noam touched on this really nicely already, when we're thinking about how we assess these abilities in other groups, we're always influenced and tarnished by human perception in itself. And we've recently done a little bit of work which has demonstrated that as animals get further away from humans on the evolutionary scale, we perceive them as both being less cognitive and having less emotions. And we found that in this work, we found that people perceive mammals as being highly cognitive, have a lot of emotion, birds as a little bit less, reptiles a little bit less, and actually amphibians and fish as being more or less the same. In everything, in terms of the learning, the intelligence, that sort of thing. But when we ask them about suffering, they group reptiles, amphibians, and fish all together, and as being significantly less than mammals and birds. And so because of that, we are always tarnished by this perception. But as scientists, we always go into designing experiments from a human perspective because we are humans. And I think one of the big points I want to make today is that we actually have to try and think not like humans in order to start to assess these questions properly. So the sorts of markers of sentience in amphibians that I'm going to be thinking about today, we're going to be thinking about their emotions. We're going to be thinking about their moods, so these sort of long-term free-floating experiences. We're going to think about complexity, as Noam's really nicely set up. And we're going to be thinking about their learning and cognition. And we're going to take this together and think, is there evidence of this in amphibians? So amphibian pain is largely understudied, and especially given their diversity and also the huge use that we have of a certain amphibian species in biomedical research. And what we've initially seen is we've seen that the traditional ways that we assess pain are not necessarily appropriate for doing so in amphibians. So using the heat type tests or using mechanical tests don't necessarily work. However, there is some interesting evidence looking at chemical tests. So you can put a little bit of acetic acid onto an amphibian, and then you will potentially see a response in that animal. And as you can see from the tables that we have up here, that response is generally diminished if you add analgesics to the animals. There is some evidence of neuroanatomical structures that we see which are associated with pain perception in mammals, in amphibians as well. But as Noam's already said, a lot of the work that we would use as evidence for this in mammals, we simply do not have in amphibians. So there is a really nice paper looking at whether there's this motivational trade-off between pain. So you will see that bullfrogs turned upside down will inhibit their writing behavior if they're going to potentially receive a shock for that. So you do see this trade-off. But there are some really key areas that we need to know a lot more about it. For example, preferences of analgesia, self-administration of these, and also Sicilians. We have nothing on this. We also need a lot more work about amphibians in general. I've listed the species that I'm aware of on here. And interestingly, what we see is we see in axolotls, they didn't respond to the analgesics. And so this is really interesting. And I think this really emphasizes a point that what we're seeing here and what we need to see might not be detectable as we as humans look for it. So if you think about a mechanical pain, for example, in a mammal, you're missing a part of your limb. That is something which is extreme. It is incredibly impactful. But actually, we know that amphibians can regenerate limbs. Axolotls, in this case, are particularly famous for this. And so one reason potentially why these standard measures that we're looking at might not be as good as they are maybe for other species is because they might not respond in the way we're potentially anticipating under these circumstances. So now I want to move on to sort of other emotions and how these are impacted by affect. So most experiments using aversive stimuli in mammals would probably use electric shock. Now, there was a whole suite of research done on this with amphibians, and it was found that they were unable to associate a neutral stimulus with something aversive in that way. But actually, shocks produce motor inhibition in amphibians. So why would we then expect them to move away from something under these conditions? So actually much more innovative, exciting work which is going on is actually using things which are relevant to the amphibian's ecology, and they're using that to assess these really crucial questions. So for example, there's work done where a stimulus is paired with a sort of toxic salt solution, which the animals do want to avoid because of the permeable nature of their skin. And then you do see aversion learning in this group. There's also nice evidence that some anxiety tests, particularly those which are potentially involving predator cues, do elicit anxiety responses in amphibians. And then the evidence for emotional fever, so having that sort of psychological fever, is mixed, but it looks to be that it needs a very extreme stimulus in order to get this sort of response. But let's move on to positive affective states. So for example, positive emotions such as pleasure. Now there isn't systematic work done on play, which is a lovely example of this in amphibians. However, Gordon Burkhardt, who Noam's already mentioned, has observed things which look like they might be play in amphibians, and there needs to be much, much more work done to start to actually document this and assess it appropriately. However, where there is some nice evidence is some evidence of preferences. So when animals are given choices between different things, they do seem to show preferences here. They could be for environmental factors such as background colors. They could be for the presence of plants or shelter, things like this. There's some lovely evidence in salamanders which shows that not only do they have preference for specific high-quality foods, but they will defend areas which have those foods in more than areas that they will defend which have the lower quality of food. And we also see nice evidence of the presence of social environment as well, and social preferences. In terms of moods, which are these sort of longer, free-flowing states, a good way to assess these is looking and understanding the impact of enrichment can have on animals. And what you see is there's some nice work which has been done with frogs, which shows that actually when they're living in enriched environments, you see positive indicators of welfare in them, including improved growth, body condition, greater activity, and things like that. And also, you see a decrease in potential negative indicators of welfare, including aggression and fear. And crucially, after having these experiences, when you give animals a choice, they do seem to show preferences for the enriched enclosure. Now, a lot of this work is done with frogs. A lot of this work is done with one species of frog as well. So when I'm saying amphibians, this again is something we need to be very, very aware of. This is not a general thing that we understand. However, the evidence of social complexity is something that we actually do seem to see across amphibians. So there is evidence of parental care. This is our only bit of purple we're going to be looking at for a while in frogs, in salamanders, and in caecilians as well. We see that they have non-random social interactions, and we know of very complex and flexible vocal communication systems in amphibians, as well as chemical communication systems as well. So all of this builds up the picture that actually we are potentially seeing some interesting and complex behaviors in this group. And of course, if you have complex social behavior, we need to understand what animals can learn from then having those interactions with others. And there's some really nice evidence of social learning, both of novel food sources and areas in which to forage, as well as transmission of fear information from a conspecific and a heterospecific as well. So again, it's starting to show that not only do they have these social behaviors, but they can actually use this information too. And the final area that I want to tell you about is our understanding of learning and cognition in this group. So this work there are some fantastic hints of some remarkable cognitive abilities. But again, there's a lot of hints of failure to find things. And this fits in with this idea that we need to start to ask the animals in the right way. But when we do ask the animals in ways that are relevant to them, we do seem to see interesting cognition in them. There's evidence of quantity discrimination, temporal learning, cognitive flexibility, and we've done some work looking at maze learning and long-term memory, and particularly we wanted to look at aspects of an amphibian lifestyle which are potentially really challenging to them. So not only did we look at long-term memory, could they learn to navigate around a maze, but actually could they retain that over a period of brumation? So when these animals are in a winter dormancy, do they retain this information? Because actually we know that brain functions are dramatically reduced. And so what we did was, this is just a little video of Frank. And this is a super simple T-maze. Now, the salamanders are being rewarded for going into a nice damp box. This is Frank, who you can just see here. We tried with food, and funnily enough, they would let their very favorite food crawl all over them and do absolutely nothing. However, they worked very, very hard for 3 minutes in a nice little damp box. So a choice was considered when Frank tipped over the barrier, and then he got to sit in his damp box for 3 minutes as his reward. And again, this is to emphasize that if you give them something which is relevant and salient to them within their ecology, you actually see remarkable abilities. And not only did we see they could learn this, they could remember this for 100 days, we also showed that they could remember this over brumation, so over their winter torpor. And the final little thing I want to touch on is learning across a life cycle. So as I've said, amphibians have this really remarkable life cycle that we don't necessarily see in other groups. And there's some wonderful work which has looked at whether they are able to learn about potential predators within the egg and retain that information after hatching. And also we've done some work, and there's some great early work as well, looking at the retention of information across metamorphosis, where, as I say, we see significant changes in it. So just to summarize, there is no one indicator of sentience, as we've already heard today, but rather it's a likelihood of sentience based on the presence of a number of markers. And what we can see here is we can see that in frogs and toads, we are starting to get evidence of these markers. Salamanders and newts to some extent, and caecilians, we really need a huge amount more work to be done. And as I said, there are 8,000 species. This evidence is probably taken from about 20. Okay? So we need a much, much broader understanding. But whilst there is still much to do, the results that we have for now at least says that there is a likelihood of sentience in this group. And I'd just like to leave you with this Japanese proverb that the frog in the well knows nothing about the sea. And it means that one should be aware of the limitations of one's own experience. And I think this is really important when we think about amphibian consciousness and sentience. We need to try and think more like a frog. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anna. And now for the last speaker in our vertebrate session, I'd like to invite up Becca Franks. She's an assistant professor of environmental studies at NYU, where she's co-director of the Wild Animal Welfare Program and director of the Water Lab. Did I say that right? Okay, good. Her research and teaching lie at the intersection of environmental and animal protection with a focus on animal behavior, human-animal relationships, aquatic animals, and quantitative methods. Welcome, Becca.
Wow, this is so great. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for organizing, and thank you all for being here. It's really an honor, and it's just an exciting time to be talking about these issues. So before I begin, I want to thank Chaowen Chang and Cami Sylvester, two graduate students here at NYU that helped me prepare the information that we're going to be talking about. And this absolutely would not have been possible without them. So let's just think about, we're talking about evidence and consciousness, for consciousness in fishes. So as we've discussed a little bit already, the theories of consciousness are many. And similarly, there's many species of fish. So I don't know if there's more theories of consciousness or more species of fish. I'll leave that to the philosophers. But there certainly are many, many different species of fish. And you can see here represented 24 different species of fish to get you sort of thinking about the really like 30,000 is kind of an overwhelming number, so I just want to put some traction on that, and these are different representations of different mouths that fishes have, and there is a radical diversity, and then just multiply that by 1,000 to give you a sense. So yeah, what's a scientist to do speaking on this topic? There's inevitably going to be some radical oversimplification, broad strokes, but what we decided to do was to take a systematic approach. So what we thought we would do is sort of think, okay, what is the evidence out there consistent with consciousness, and what is the evidence out there not consistent with consciousness? And then we had to pick a theory of consciousness to work with. So somewhat at random, we picked this theory of consciousness. So Birch and colleagues in 2020 described 5 different dimensions to be considered for consciousness: perceptual richness, the degree to which different sensory modalities are providing information for the experience of the animal; evaluative richness, the degree to which we have different sort of valenced responses or affective states in response to the experiences that we have; integration at a time, that you have a single cohesive experience at a single moment in time; integration across time, that you have sort of, my understanding is this of this is like something like a personal narrative, a integrated sense of progress over time; and then self-consciousness, a sense of self and self-awareness. So again, oversimplification here. I mean consistent with these dimensions, but that's long, and I didn't have as much space on my slide, so we'll just call it 4. But I do mean consistent with. So if we do a systematic review of the literature on fishes, these 30,000 different species, and we're looking for perceptual richness, there can be evidence for perceptual richness just because an animal responds to a certain sensory, stimulus. But how do you know that it's consciously felt? So earlier this morning, Jonathan spoke about this phenomenon of blind sight, where you can have human subjects who do not report a conscious experience of seeing, but are able to navigate the world as if they could see. So there's apparently some disjoint between being able to engage in complex behaviors using sensory information and consciousness. So just being able to use sensory information could be consistent with consciousness, but isn't necessarily evidence for it. So a higher bar would be trace conditioning, where you have a separation of the stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus and the stimulus and separated in time. And it seems like for humans that requires a conscious awareness of the stimulus, and if they're not conscious of it, you don't see a response. So just looking for trace conditioning in fishes, we found 12 studies that showed trace conditioning in fishes. And this is across the whole, 30,000 different fishes, all the way from some teleosts, which are the main, like 95% of the fishes are teleosts, but also the elasma branches, which are the cartilaginous fishes like sharks and ray, so very, very, very distant relatives, evidence in both. Evaluative richness, most famously studied in fish, is pain, so experiencing motivational trade-offs. So again, here we're oversimplifying. We're not looking for a super high bar here, but just was there evidence that was suggestive of pain in a species of fish? And there were 55 studies out there. This is definitely by far the most commonly studied dimension, although of course there's many other dimensions of evaluative richness, not just pain, but we found 55. Integration at a time, we don't know of any particular studies that show this precisely, but fish do show behavioral lateralization where they process information using one eye preferentially versus another eye. So that sets the stage for at least some research that could be done, leveraging that different way that they're processing information and looking the degree to which that's being integrated. And integration across time, again, we don't know of any like concrete specific studies that are looking for this precisely, but at least suggestive evidence is that several different species of fish now have been observed to use tools, which indicate some sense of planning and indication that they have a sense of time A and time B being connected and can make use of that integration across time. So again, not proof positive, but at least in a promising area that could warrant further follow-up. Then for self-consciousness, there are now 7 studies that suggest mirror self-recognition in a range of fish species, and again, including the elasma branches. So there's manta rays that have shown signs that are consistent with mirror self-recognition, and if I get a chance, I'll talk more about that study specifically. Okay, so the evidence against. What I mean is inconsistent with. For perceptual richness, there's no studies that suggest that they don't have perceptual richness. That just hasn't been shown. Like every time that this has been studied, they show trace conditioning. Evaluative richness, we found no studies. I know you think that this is impossible. So ... we'll come back to this because of course this is where all of the debate exists around fish consciousness is that, you know, we have this doubt that fish can feel pain in the evaluative richness dimension. And quite frankly, we did not find evidence for that, but I assure you I will return to that. There wasn't any evidence suggesting that they don't integrate at a time. There wasn't any evidence suggesting that they don't integrate across times. And there were 2 studies where they failed the mirror self-recognition test. Okay, so returning to this, because I know you don't believe me. So the real crucial thing that I'd like to point out here is what we're looking for is evidence that fish do not feel pain. Evidence. So there's a long debate and a long history of academic engagement with this topic. And most of that debate and engagement has been about the fact that the existing evidence is not sufficient or compelling for some people, which I agree with. Any single study is not going to be determinatively showing that an animal is conscious or can feel pain. We don't have studies like that. So this is legitimate, but it's not actually evidence that they do not feel pain. It's just being unswayed by the existing evidence that's piecemeal about the fact that that is consistent with the idea that they do. So what is the actual evidence that they do not feel pain? So we found the main evidence is anatomical, and there's many studies that are anatomical studies that the authors often use to suggest that they don't feel pain. Behaviorally, we were only able to identify 9 that are cited by the folks who are skeptical of fish pain. So then anatomical research has shown that fish have different anatomy than we do. I would like to point out that I agree with this. They certainly do, they most certainly do. However, I just would like to push back that this is not evidence that they do not feel pain. This is evidence that they do not have that pathway of feeling pain. So birds cannot fly without feathers. That doesn't mean that bats can't fly. They don't have feathers, they just achieve it through a different mechanism. And so it does suggest that they don't have the same way of feeling pain, they don't have the same pathways because they don't have the same anatomy, but it's not evidence that they do not feel pain. It sort of, leaves open the possibility of there might be a different pathway or maybe they don't feel pain, but it's not evidence that they do not feel pain. So I think we should put this to the side for now. Then, if we're looking at the behavioral work, we looked into the original studies that were being cited in these review papers, and they sort of fall into 2 bends. One is recovery from invasive procedures, and the other one is that they don't learn after they've been caught in a fishing, like with a hook. So the idea behind the recovery from invasive procedures is that they have undergone some incredibly invasive procedure where there's been some surgery, and they seem to do fine after the procedure. If you go back to the original study, however, that they cite, there's only one. And I have to say that it's quite unclear, because the study that they cite is about administering analgesics and anesthesia to fishes before you do these surgeries, where you attach a telemetric device to them, either externally or intragastrically in their mouth, or surgically inside of the body cavity. The paper itself is about giving fish analgesics and anesthetics so that they are able to recover from the procedure well. That's what the original paper was. And so then they do show that they are able to recover from the procedure reasonably well, but not perfectly. So it's at least unclear, this one study. Then from not learning from hooking, so this idea that you get caught in the mouth by a hook, and then it's something that you don't care about. This is inconsistent with our understanding of pain, for humans at least. There was one paper that the authors themselves said that the fish didn't seem to be bothered by this. There were two more that were unclear or mixed, but there were actually 5 that were papers that we had not identified that actually the authors themselves say that the fish were feeling pain. So just to give you an example of what I'm talking about here, so this is from one of the review papers that is skeptical of fish being able to feel pain. With repeated capture, angled fishes Capture of angled fishes also is consistent with the notion that catch and release fishing does not induce a state of pain similar, and then they have all of these citations here. So we went back and looked at them. I'm just going to pull your attention to this one. And in the reference list itself, these are the 2 papers. So this is supposed to be evidence that fish do not feel pain, behavioral evidence that fish do not feel pain. One of them is decreased catchability through one-trial learning, right there in the title, that they are learning just from one experience with the hook to avoid this stimulus. That is, and the authors talk about it as an aversive experience for the fish. And then in the second one being acquired hook avoidance in the pike, again, showing that overexposure to hooking, fish tend to avoid the hook. This is starting to sound like a motivational trade-off. They want the food, they have experience getting the food and getting hooked, and they decide they don't like being hooked. That maybe was an aversive experience. This is a motivational trade-off, where they are preferring now to avoid the food that they want for the sake of not being exposed to this experience. Okay, so just integrating that with our new column, actually we ended up with 5 more studies that are consistent with evaluative richness and 1 against. So we do have a preponderance of evidence in the for column and some evidence in the against column, but it's, around 95% is in the consistent with. So one of the things I would also just like to suggest, especially as we're moving forward and thinking about this, I mean, clearly there's not anywhere near as many studies here as there are species of fishes, and there's so much more to be discovered, and even within the domain of evaluative richness, that was all about pain. Nothing about joy, nothing about pleasure, nothing about comfort, nothing about social preferences. So there's so much more even just to one of these single dimensions. So there's obviously so much more to explore. And I think to some extent, dropping this for against kind of framing might be useful, and then again, somewhat randomly, taking up some other insights from philosophers, actually just approaching these questions with understanding, okay, just what can we understand about these animals? Not if we're taking a skeptical, it needs to be for or against consciousness, but instead just trying to explore the ways in which these animals are conscious and really get to understand them better through that process of asking questions and collecting objective data about how they perceive their world and what matters to them. So with that, yeah, thank you. I can explain this if later, but yeah.
Thank you so much for that great talk, Becca. I'd like to invite all of our speakers to return to the stage for our discussion. We have 40 minutes for questions, and I'm going to ask you the first question. Because as scientists, right, in my talk I said something about how scientists were being trained not to study consciousness. But yet, here you are, scientists studying consciousness. And so I'm wondering if there is like a study or an experience or an observation in your past that led you to change your mind and think that you can be studying animal consciousness or get convinced about consciousness in the taxa that you were discussing. So why don't we start with Noam and we'll go down the row.
So, this is an anecdote, but it's based on an actual paper. Back when Gordon Burkhardt started studying play in reptiles, he worked with a turtle called Pigface, and he gave Pigface a bunch of toys, objects, and the turtle interacted with the toys, and when people looked at the videos, nobody was convinced that this was play. Until Gordon had the idea to speed the videos up. And then suddenly, everybody looked at the videos and went, oh, the turtle is playing with these objects. And I think that this highlights a struggle that we have, that the species, reptiles especially, but I think all the species that we're talking about today, suffer from what I would call a failure of anthropomorphism. They don't look like us. We find it difficult to identify with them. Reptiles don't have facial musculature. They can't make facial expressions. Snakes don't have eyelids, so they don't even blink at you. They don't have limbs. And this makes it, when we see animals that we can identify with better, we're more likely to believe that, oh, this thing can self-recognize and can feel pain and all of that. So I think that the challenge is for us to kind of expand our imaginations to be able to see ourselves in these other animals and, kind of speed up the videos of what we believe in our heads, to manage to do that to these less species that aren't as close to us and so don't react in ways that are obviously like us.
Great. Thanks, Noam. Anna.
Thank you very much. Now, this is a really interesting question because I was raised in my academic life thinking exactly with those 3 books you showed. They're my books. They're in the shelf. Thinking exactly that this is not something we can start to probe if we're interested in animal cognition. We need to avoid this, and we need to focus on the cognitive side. And I think this is possibly because of how we as cognitive scientists were defining consciousness and sentience. And I think if we then go back and think of the definitions that we've had from Jonathan this morning, it's actually something that in animal cognition we use all the time because we use rewards, we use punishments. And if the animals do not have a valence response to that, that is something that then becomes it's not rewarding, right? So we can't use it. And I think for me, there isn't one big study for amphibian sentience which stands out. But I think in general what stands out to me is that when we ask our species a question in a way that is relevant to that species, you see quite astounding results in some cases. And I think the lesson for me is we have to learn how to do that in the right way for the group of animals that we're working with.
Thanks. So it sounds like we need to not just understand the radically different species from human species when we're studying them, but we also have to try to understand the radically different humans coming from different disciplines when we have these kinds of conversations.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. Becca.
I'm having a hard time picking, but I think I'll just start since it's on the screen here. So when I started working with zebrafish, these are some zebrafish who I worked with for my postdoc at UBC. I had worked with many different species, and I was starting out working with this new species, and I had never worked with fish before. And I knew I was going to get things wrong, and I made the decision that I want to be wrong in that I think of them as being capable of more, and then I can ratchet down my expectations rather than think they're capable of less and then having to ratchet up. So I had just gone into this experience thinking that. And so I really had high expectations of what they were capable of, and frankly, my expectations were still too low. Like, they impressed me. These little itsy-bitsy fish, they're just like this big, just had the most complex behaviors. They had these lives that just, this time scale issue for them, it was an issue of slowing down because they're very fast. We recorded them in high definition video, and even the high definition video made them look blurry. So this is from an HD video. So they really blew me away, and they did more than I was ever able to capture. And they're now the most studied animals on the planet. They've exceeded use in science now beyond mice and rats. So numerically, we've been studying these little fish a lot, and we were still discovering things about them that just hadn't been documented. Like what I have here is that they appear to be nesting. They're digging up a cavity out from underneath this rock in their enclosure, and they're not thought to be a nesting species. And how I could, with this shoestring budget, make some potential fundamental discovery about zebrafish as these heavily studied animals just to me seems totally wild. And I don't know that they were nesting because I didn't have enough resources to follow up on it, but they did it in the morning, which is when they spawn, and it's consistent with that. Anyway, so they really blew me away and really made me think about everything that they're capable of. And if I can just very quickly, the manta ray study of the mirror self-recognition, it's not technically passing the mark test. This example of this study is not evidence of passing the mark test. But what's incredible, so manta rays, they're these giant elasmobranch branch fishes. They're cartilaginous fishes. They couldn't be more distantly related to us. And they have this really bizarre body plan from our perspective. And they have these cephalatic fins, which are at the front, and sort of they pull in nutrients like this with them. And so they're sometimes out like that and sometimes like this. And when you put the mirror in with them, they started doing loop-de-loops in front of the mirror. Then they started opening up their cephalatic fins and trying to gaze into their mouth, which is exactly what chimpanzees and young children do when the first time they're exposed to mirrors. And then they started inspecting their gills. And then they started doing loop-de-loops and blowing bubbles, which had never been seen before. So, this mere question of can you recognize yourself in the mirror, some people are not going to be swayed by this because there wasn't a mark involved. But we discovered all of this stuff about them because of it, and that they can apparently blow bubbles and seem to be sort of interested in mouths. They're, whether or not they know it's their mouth or it's somebody else's mouth, there's a lot of interest in the mouth. So I just think that this is really fascinating and just very intriguing. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much. Yeah, so much to learn. We're just scratching the surface. So we will take questions from the audience now. And let's start in the back of the room. I don't know your name, the woman with the blonde, white hair. Yeah.
Hi, so I found these talks super, super fascinating. But one thing I found that I kept just wondering is how you think about harm to your research subjects from an ethical point of view. And that could be, I guess, to all three, if there's time to answer.
Thank you so much for that question. I think it's absolutely crucial, and I'm really grateful that you asked that question. I think that for me, I don't do research that I am, aware that I'm harming, and I try to ensure that the animals have the option to opt out of the research so that they have the freedom to move away from whatever I'm doing. And I also try to be aware that I might be unintentionally harming them, and so I'm just trying to keep an eye on that. And I do that for ethical reasons, but I also do that for scientific reasons, because I think that when animals are in environments where they feel comfortable and there is a sense of being able to express their full behavioral repertoire, you actually get a lot more rich and interesting information about their lives. And so the more that I am able to cultivate an environment in which they feel comfortable and not under threat, I think the more interesting the data can be as well.
I can go next for that one. So I also don't do invasive research, and I think whilst I think it is a really important place, it can tell us a lot of information. I think we can also be quite imaginative in how we can approach some of the questions. So I do a lot of work looking at how enrichment can impact welfare and cognition in reptiles, for example, and you don't need to give them a barren worst-case environment for that. What we do is we look at a standard environment based on recommendations, and then we look at a really good environment. And do you see differences on the basis of that? Yes, you do. So you can still start to assess these questions, but you do it in a slightly different way.
Yeah, so everything they said. Definitely what Becca said about the scientific results. We don't want our animals to be stressed or unhappy, because then the behavior that they give us is not interesting, is not representative of their natural behaviors. I do every now and then do slightly invasive research because I think it's important, because I think it teaches us a lot. But we take great care, as much as we possibly can, to minimize any discomfort or pain to the animal. Obviously, there are bodies that keep us honest when we're doing that. I think that I like to think that the snakes in my lab have a much better life than snakes that are out in the wild. I don't know that that's true. We certainly try to do everything that we can to enable them to engage in whatever natural behaviors we can let them engage in. And if we knew for sure that we were succeeding, that would answer a lot of these questions about sentience, I think. So that would be nice.
Thank you. Yeah. So the gentleman in the pink and blue check shirt next.
So this is all fascinating. What I'm hearing a lot of is that for each animal species being discussed, that there's a lot of cumulative evidence that you cite. And what I'd like to hear more of is which of these signs you find the most convincing and which the least convincing. And I suppose for me, what would be at the bottom end of the spectrum so far is the evidence that the animal prefers a rich environment, which would seem to me to be something you'd expect of any species, maybe plants as well. Maybe the roots grow towards where there's a rich source. And I wouldn't think that that's good evidence of some kind of joy that the plants are experiencing.
So I agree, and I think that, you know, again, as Anna was saying, having been trained as, you know, comparative psychologists, I can come up with deflationary explanations for any behavior you pick, pretty much, including recognizing yourself in a mirror, including withdrawing from a painful stimulus, including seeking a painkiller. So I think that there aren't going to be perfect, you know, behavioral indicators or even neuroscientific indicators that tell us for sure, oh, this is the smoking gun. I actually think that it is a cumulative, gradual accretion of things where you go, okay, if I only saw this one thing, I could explain that away. If I only saw this one thing, I could explain it away. If I have 15 different things, it makes a lot more sense, if I can go way back in the history of psychology, to say there's an intervening variable here that I'm not seeing, which I'm going to call consciousness, which now explains all of these things at once. That now becomes the simpler explanation, or maybe the more likely to be better explanation. So I think we can rank, like, some things are better markers, some things are worse markers. I think we might all have different opinions about what those rankings might be, but I actually am a big believer in the cumulative effect being the important one.
I agree.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. I think just to have like a woe is me scientists moment, that the best studies are like these motivational trade-offs that are learned, but they are so hard to implement. And quite frankly, I don't know that I would pass them because you have to imagine that you get repeatedly exposed to pain and you don't know. and then you get repeatedly exposed to some analgesic, and you also don't know that that's happening. And then you have to wander around until you like bump into the analgesic, and then you have to associate that analgesic with wandering that you went in this particular direction. I mean, it's like, it's a heavy lift. So I think some of the best studies that we have are just incredibly hard to implement, and they could sort of gum up the works into actually just discovering really fascinating things about these animals if we take an approach of flipping the null, assuming that there is some conscious experience there. What is it like? What does it look like? And then there's a different bar that has to be passed to show that it's for sure conscious and couldn't be done any other way, and that's a different sort of thing. But if we just say, actually, no, we accept that there might be something like consciousness going on here, what is the nature of that thing? Then you get to ask a full set of questions that are easier for us to do.
Yeah, great. So we have a related question online from one of our initial signatories, Liad Mudrik, who works on human consciousness. So I'm going to present her version of the question and see if you get any other kinds of answers, we get any kind of different answers from that. So she says, given the justified differentiation that Jonathan introduced between consciousness and intelligence, how should we consider the impressive findings about learning and other cognitive functions in animals? Unless there are specific functions that are held to require conscious processing, which of course are we're far away from having any agreement about that. Can these what we're learning about learning and cognitive functions, can they really inform our position about animal consciousness? Do you have anything to add about that?
So I think this goes back to perhaps what Jonathan also mentioned, which is in order to properly answer that, you have to have some idea of what consciousness is for, what consciousness does. So Jonathan, or one of you mentioned the facilitation hypothesis. If you think that that's what consciousness does, that it facilitates these really complex things, then showing evidence of complex learning is very suggestive. If you think that consciousness is an epiphenomenon and doesn't do anything, then all the evidence on learning in the world isn't going to budge you. Mm-hmm. So I think we can get away with not committing to a theory of consciousness for a while. I don't know if that's a strategy forever. But that's, then I would ask my philosopher friends about that. I wouldn't dare to venture an opinion on my own.
Please do. Yeah, but it seems like then maybe there's two different kinds of theoretical approaches we can take. One is a full-blown theory of consciousness on the one hand, and the other is a theoretical commitment to an evolutionary function for consciousness, which might exist in the face of different full-blown theories of consciousness.
Yeah, that's a much better answer, thank you.
No, that's what you said. Any follow-ups?
I think that's a great answer. Yeah, thanks.
So we can go right in the back there. Yeah, black hair, gray jacket. And then we'll move forward. I was just starting in the back.
Thank you. I'm Hazel, and thank you for sharing so many lab stories. They're all interesting, and the testes are so cute. So my question is, do we use the same way to design an experiment when we don't know whether human or non-human animals have certain abilities, or how much is the same, or why it's different? For example, do we use the same way to test how enrichment affects the brain development in we humans and non-human animals? Or do we use mirror and marks to know when does a human child begin to have a greater gather snake sense of self? How do we test if human pain and motivational trade-off, and how much of we know about people come from electric shock experiments, and how much from observations and experience if we don't share the same language? In what ways are laboratory statics and irreplaceable for observing animal behaviors in the natural environment? Sorry, lots of questions.
I'll take the last one. So I think that was how much is what we see in a laboratory reflective of what an animal would naturally do. And I think that's a really, really important question. And I think we've seen, certainly in the reptile and amphibian data and in some of the fish, is that it's about understanding what they do in their natural environment, which can actually allow us to ask these questions in an appropriate way in the laboratory. And I think what we have to do, and it's something that as comparative psychologists we maybe haven't done so well a lot, which is why we've got a lot of data from mammals, because we're kind of good at imagining what's important to mammals and much less in other more distant species. So I think we have to use wild behavior to allow us to ask the questions in an appropriate way of in the lab. But equally, can we then translate that into nature again, right? And I think that laboratory experiments are a wonderful way of, it gives us control. It allows us to test hypotheses in ways that we can pull apart different questions in a way you can't necessarily do in the wild. But then you want to then test that and see what animals might then naturally do later. So I think we have to kind of go both ways with that.
Just to add to the section about humans, there is an increasing movement to start testing humans on various cognitive tasks in the same way that we test animals. So don't give them any instructions. Don't, walk them through the task. Just drop them in it like you would a pigeon in an operant box. And that provides a lot of very interesting results. On the mirror self-recognition test specifically, it's actually interesting, right when Gordon Gallup was doing the first of these tests with chimpanzees, they were also pretty much at the same time being done on children. And you can do them in exactly the same way in children as you do on chimpanzees, and children pass them, somewhere between a year and 18 months of age. Again, you don't explain anything to them, you just show them a mirror and suddenly there's something weird on their face.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, you've got the next question.
Hi, John Kuby. So all of you work in vertebrates, and I take some issue with Dr. Franks about all the fish having different brains. Vertebrates have a brain plan, and I'm wondering if you can see commonalities. I'll give you one quick example. The medial cortex is presumed to be the mammalian hippocampus, and in a whole range of animals, damage to the medial cortex disrupts complex navigational behavior. So are there other examples of where we can look at regions of the brain and guess about essential conscious or cognitive functions?
So yes, reptiles have a brain plan. There's a lot of variation in that brain plan. So if you're a reptile, avian or non-avian reptile, your brain plan is primarily nuclear rather than layered. Like a mammalian cortex, reptiles have like a 3-layered bit. Nobody's really sure what that is or what it does. So there's a lot of variation within the brain plan. I don't know. So there are debates about what people call substrate independence, right? Do you need a certain kind of brain structure in order to do a certain kind of computation? And that, again, is a topic that, what was the quote from John Pierce? Like, I would not dare to tread there because the philosophers, that's their bailiwick. But so I don't know that we know enough about how the brain creates consciousness to say this is what you need. I know there are theories that say you need a cortex, you need a medial cortex. We've done studies on, for example, the hippocampus in birds, and it seems to work a little bit like the hippocampus in mammals, but also differently in a lot of ways. And I think that this connects to a larger issue. Sorry, I'm all over the place, but this connects to a larger issue, which is that even our current division of cognitive tasks in humans doesn't map on very well to brain structures, right? There's a whole cognitive ontology movement trying to fix that. That problem is multiplied several-fold when you go to other species. So I think it's premature to say, here's the brain plan that you need for consciousness, because we don't even know which parts of that brain plan are important. And so that now when you change brain plan, when you go outside of mammals, outside of vertebrates, who knows if you can do consciousness with different kinds of brains, or if the bits of the brains that are the same are the ones that really matter for consciousness.
Great. So the next question will be online, and then you're next. So you can get the mic over there. This is for Becca. It's from Georgia Mason. Georgia asks, people who fail to learn in trace conditioning tasks aren't unaware of the predictive cue, and nor are they unaware of the aversive air puff in the average eye blink task. They just don't get the contingency between them. So can you unpack why you think trace conditioning is important to this debate?
Well, I think that this is absolutely outside of my area of expertise, so I'll just preface it with that dodge. But I don't think that I'm trying to say that it's proof positive and that there's no other way of getting to that conditioning and that it's definitely a sign of consciousness. What I'm trying to say is that if we just looked for perceptual abilities in fishes, we would come up with thousands of studies, and I felt like that was maybe just a little bit too much of a broad swath. So I was trying to be a little bit more narrow. And so they can do trace conditioning, and there isn't evidence, there's not any published studies that that suggest that they don't, which they could have failed. There could have been evidence that they can't do it. So I think the fact that there's 12 studies that show that they can, and it's across a wide range of species, to me is just more like adding up to this like broader, as Noam was talking about, like there's no one study that we have, there's just multiple studies, and I'm not putting everything on trace conditioning by any means.
Okay, thanks. All right, and yeah, you've got the next question.
My name is it on?
It's on.
My name is Aviatik, and first of all, thank you for talking to us. And Anna, my question is, do you think that parental care you mentioned in amphibians is just a survival concept, or if it could also be an emotional behavior?
Thank you for that question. It's a really interesting one. So there's been some wonderful work with poison dart frogs, the little brightly colored ones, which we all like, looking at the role of what is potentially innate behavior in their parental care versus what they show flexibility in. And it seems to be that there are some aspects which they're very, very flexible. So, for example, depending if they're in their territory, they will respond differently to a tadpole, which is there versus a tadpole outside of their territory. But there are also things which are very innate. So if they will transport tadpoles on their backs to pools, and if there is a tadpole on their back, they will do that. So there seems to be a real mixture within that, and I think they're a really nice example of that, and I think that there is a lot more we need to start to explore to truly understand what the limits are and where that flexibility does exist. Thank you.
Great, fascinating. I saw hands over here. Yeah, back in there. Yep, you, sorry.
Hi, Devin again. I guess I had a question about mirror tests because this seems like an obvious possible complication, but I never hear it discussed. Have there been any attempts to compare the performance of species that have access to relatively clear, relatively still water? It seems like these might be species who would have prior experience with reflections, or maybe even have a reason to adapt relative to them in their natural environment. Whereas things like fish, I'm not sure when they would see their reflections in water. Mammals and birds might be more likely to have access to relatively clear, relatively still water. I'm wondering if there have been any attempts to study this and how it might have biased results.
I'm not an expert on mirror self-recognition either. Sorry to just keep saying I don't know. But I would just note that actually, if you're looking up at the surface of water, it is can serve as a mirror from certain angles. So fishes would have experience from that perspective. It's just the opposite of ours, and I don't know if my...
So I would add, so if you're a fish looking at the surface of the water, you can't see yourself. Because of Snell's window, you can only see things far away. But if you're a fish that was born and grew up in a tank, the walls of the tank right? Because you've got this water-glass-air interface, because of the refractive indices, the walls of the tank serve as a mirror, and you possibly can see yourself in it. I've done this with a GoPro in the water. Totally, they can see themselves. The question of animals having access to kind of still water or not is a really interesting one. I don't know of a lot of animals that wouldn't, in the wild, at one point or another, encounter like a still pond. I've always thought that that's a sufficiently rare occurrence in any animal's life that it's not going to lead you to evolve self-recognition. And I know, Gordon Gallup has said, well, the whole point is not that this is something in your ecology. The whole point is that this is a skill that you can just do because you have different sophisticated cognitive abilities that allow you to recognize yourself in whatever modality. That's a more longer and more complicated way of saying I also don't know.
I think something to add there, not in relation to self-recognition, but there's some really nice work looking at picture-object recognition, where an animal can recognize that a picture potentially represents something, but isn't that thing. And experience seems to play a hugely important role in that across species, including humans. And that having had experience of it, many species are then able to learn that representative nature. And I think that slightly taps into some of the things that you were thinking of.
Great. So many questions, but the next question goes right here, yeah.
Oh, okay. Hi. So I was thinking about maybe if you guys could talk about distinctions between avoiding damage, pain, and suffering. So it seems that to avoid damage doesn't really imply that there's any feeling going on. We can program robots to avoid damage, and when they identify, okay, systems had been attacked, to go into the opposite direction, learning from that. But then pain seems to have an attachment of feeling, but it also could be just an instance. We could have an instance of pain and then never experience it again. But then the concept of suffering potentially has a prolonged temporal sense to it. And like when we talk about human beings that suffer, we identify a change in their behavior, like their shoulders shrug, or they're frowning more, or they walk slower. So I'm wondering if you guys have come across any behavioral differences in your studies about suffering as opposed to pain with invertebrates.
I think that's such a great point, and I think under-discussed. And even the modality of the pain as well. So from the perspective of the fishes, a lot of the pain work that's done is about, essentially getting hooked. And you could imagine that might not be the main, at least welfare issue for fishes around the world. And in fact, from a fish's perspective, probably a really huge source of pain would be oxygen deprivation, because they live in we're just accustomed to living in an environment that has a pretty constant oxygen content, and we can't even tell when oxygen is being drained out of the room, so it's not something that's like part of our awareness, but it for sure is something that is likely part of a fish's awareness, and whether or not they seek out more oxygenated waters, and what it feels like for them, or what the experience is like for them to be stuck in an oxygen poor environment or an oxygen oversaturated environment, for them might be something that is incredibly salient and would be the first thing that they would test around pain. And we don't test that in this conversation about consciousness with fish. So I think that there's like a lack of that. And then to your point about, is it even getting at, suffering? And I think that is such a critical point. And there is such a difference between, getting pinpricked and just finding that to be an unpleasant felt experience, and feeling depression, and actually not caring, and being in a state of non-caringness, a loss of pleasure, anhedonia, and the sort of existential pain that comes along with that. And so we see animals, having something that would be similar, I would argue, to anhedonia with learned helplessness, where they stop moving and stop responding to the world. And then there's also recent tests that have been developed to get at the mood that Anna was talking about, dimension of just having a general negative cast on the world, where you get an ambiguous cue and it's interpreted as a sign of threat or as a sign of negative thing happening, and that's sort of this more generalized sense. And so these studies are called like cognitive bias tests or cognitive judgment tests, and those are starting to be tested in a wide range of species, including invertebrates we might hear about this afternoon.
I'd just add the distinction between just avoiding damage and pain. That's a critical one, right? And again, in the tradition that Kristen was talking about, we would talk about nociception and not say anything about pain. And I think, all of the evidence that we're trying to collect with seeking analgesia and guarding injured sites is an attempt to move from nociception to pain. One thing that's maybe relevant, we know that to the suffering question, we know that animals that are kept in very poor conditions will sometimes start injuring themselves. I told the story of Pigface, this turtle that Gordon Burkhardt worked with. The reason they started giving that turtle toys was because he kept injuring himself. And in fact, once they gave him the toys, the incidence of that went way down. I don't know why animals injure themselves, but human beings in really terrible conditions also sometimes injure themselves, and feeling is very much a part of the reason for that. So maybe the same thing is happening in animals, but I'm not sure.
I'd just like to add to a little bit that Becca was saying about the cognitive judgment bias. It's a really wonderful technique which has been taken from human psychology and applied to animals. And it's about asking the animal, is your glass half full or is your glass half empty? And you can do that in a whole range of conditions as well. So you can look at it in terms of the housing, you can look at it in terms of social interaction. And I think it's a really superb mechanism to start to tap into exactly the questions you're interested in.
Great. So I really want to take one more question, even though we're supposed to break in 3 minutes. So should we take one more question? You've got it? Oh, all right. We'll give it to Matthias.
Thank you very much. Super interesting. I was just wondering about the evidence you give with analgesics and why you think that's relevant, because as you said, there's a big difference between nociception and pain. And the site of action of many analgesics is actually not just the brain. It's also in the peripheral system, in the spinal cord. So analgesics are not just painkillers. They're also nociception killer and behavior killer. So why do you think the evidence just from the fact that they respond to analgesics, why do you think that tells us anything about pain and not just unconscious nociception?
So I think it's relevant because actually we know so little, right? Particularly when we're talking about amphibians, there's so little information available. The fact that they do respond to it, that starts to tell us that then we can start to ask more complex questions. And I think I entirely take your point there. I think it's a very good one. But I think if we don't have that as a basis, where do we then move from here? And I think it's a really important starting point to then build on.
Yeah, and that's a great answer. I just would add too that it's not evidence that it's not felt either. So, it's consistent with, yes, the analgesic that I put on my, scratch or something like that is operating at the site itself, but it's also changing my experience. And so the question is, what's your baseline for thinking about what these animals are experiencing? And if the baseline is just trying to understand, how they're responding to the world and what changes their responses to the world. And then the question of high bar consciousness, are they fully lights on or lights off, I think is just a slightly separate stream. And if we're just trying to build up a sense of what is their life like, it feeds into that very much.
Great. Well, we are out of time, sadly, but I hope perhaps we can continue the discussion during our lunch break. We're back in 1 hour. Hour and a half at 2:30. Okay, thank you. Thank you.